Perfect, okay. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Olivia Gallucci, and this is a presentation on honors research I completed last semester under Professor Sylvia Perez-Hardy. You may have her as a teacher at some point in your academic career, and she is great for sponsoring research because she likes that stuff a lot. So this is titled The Effectiveness of Threat Mitigation in Layers of the Open Systems Interconnection Model. And this was the presentation I was invited to do at the Women in Cybersecurity International Conference in Denver earlier this month. So first, a quick introduction. Hi, my name is Olivia Gallucci. I'm a CS and CSEC double major. I'm the treasurer of RITSEC and the vice president of RIT's Women in Cybersecurity chapter. I'm a FOSS advocate and proud Linux user. And to learn more about me or my research, you can visit my website, oliviagallucci.com, or follow me on social media. So the focus of my research was really to examine the OSI model and to find vulnerabilities at each layer. Then from this, I would find possible mitigations and figure out how small businesses could use these mitigations in security decisions. So what is the OSI model? Oops. All right, the OSI model is a 7-layer reference model. A reference model means that it provides standards and protocols that can be used to compare layers of the network and assist in connectivity issues and consistency issues throughout the network. The OSI model also provides valuable insight into the design and implementation of networking models and protocols. The 7 layers from bottom to top include physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, and application. In general, the lower layers of the model are linked with hardware, while the upper layers of the model are linked with software. To remember the model, or to remember the, what are they called, layers, I like to use a mnemonic, specifically a priest saw 2 nuns doing push-ups. The physical layer of the OSI model, or the first layer, contains the electrical, mechanical, and functional means of establishing physical connections between layer 2 devices like switches. This means that layer 1 consists of things like cabling and electronics. A protocol for this layer is the message transfer part, or MTP1. Another thing to look at here is actually Manchester encoding and how it relates to layer 1 as well, but that's complicated, so I'm not going to talk about that. Layer 1 attacks focus on disrupting connection services in any manner possible, primarily resulting in denial of service attacks, or these disruptions can be caused by really anything. You can physically cut the cables, you can unplug cables, and it will cause an error. And they're really kind of sudden. These are things that you often can't always predict. So you'll hear about them on the news, and they're like, oh, this horrible attack, and yeah, they usually are pretty bad. So this also includes things like environmental issues as well. For example, your building catches fire and everything's destroyed. Ways to prevent these issues include subscribing to web infrastructure services like Cloudflare. In addition, implementing means of access control is a smart idea. This would be things like physical security, locking computers, and using password managers. Lastly, having multiple backups in different locations is crucial, because if there's an earthquake in one part of the world and it disrupts all your connection services over there, you're probably going to lose a bunch of money if you don't have other means and other backup areas around that to reinstantiate those servers once they're back up. Also protects you from lawsuits if you lose all their data or money or something. So next, we have the data link layer. This layer is responsible for the construction of data link connections between network layer entities. Switches at layer 2 forward LAN frames based upon MAC addresses contained within those frames. Then the layer 2 LAN protocols will be split into 2 major areas, primarily logical link control, LLC, and media access control, MAC or MAC. These become sublayers within the model. MAC will deal with the hardware addresses of the LAN card, which are unique hard-coded addresses. And then LLC will provide the protocol data units, or PDUs, which contain the addressing information. Protocols that operate at this layer are MPT2, Spanning Tree Protocol, STP, and Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, or DHCP. Since layer 2 focuses on the methods for delivering data, switch security is huge. Here, switches often use STP and DHCP for dynamic IP assignment. Attacks at this layer focus on the insecurity of the protocols used or the lack of hardening on the router devices themselves. Just so everyone's aware, router hardening is a security term that essentially just means locking it down for maximum security. One thing to watch out for in an organization are like malicious and ignorant employees, because they can mess with like the switches and the LAN connectivity and all that, and then it will break stuff, and then a whole bunch of security issues will happen. And the unfortunate part about this is that it's very easy to do. Like, it's really easy to mess up this type of stuff, and then people will often like to blame it on like, what are they called, like nation-state adversaries or whatever, and it just wasn't. It was just some dude messing around in like the basement and effed up a bunch of stuff. So there's that. So MAC flooding and ARP poisoning are the things to look out for primarily. MAC flooding is where legitimate MAC table contents are forced out of the table, and this forces the switch to start unicast flooding. And this could potentially send sensitive information to parts of the network it's not intended to go. You can think of MAC flooding as a dam breaking, where all of the good data is held within the dam, but an overwhelming force, i.e. the MAC flooding, pushes the water to break the dam. When the dam breaks, the debris is spread everywhere, but there's no guarantee that the debris is going to hit somewhere sensitive, i.e. that the debris or the sensitive data will get to the attacker. Another issue is ARP poisoning, which is an attack that disrupts, redirects, or can spy on network traffic. The common purpose of ARP is to translate between MAC addresses at the data link layer and IP addresses at the network layer. It allows network devices to ask the device like what it's currently assigned to, like what IP address it currently has. And then ARP poisoning will consist of a bunch of like, I guess, weaknesses. Like, I don't want to say ARP, the protocol itself, is just weak, but it's really exploiting the weaknesses within the protocol itself. And it will corrupt the MAC to IP mappings. So it will make the attacker look like the normal person. So it will look like an adversary is me when it's just not. So all of that data that's supposed to be going to me will go to them. Ways to mitigate these risks include ensuring that network switches are hardened, ARP inspection, and disabling unused ports. All right, next we have the network layer. Layer 3 deals with like logical addressing and forwarding data. So this is things like really just error control, sequencing, like all the really tiny small steps that the data needs to do, like where it needs to go in order to be transported. So you could think of this like the transportation for a trip. First, you would specify where you are and where you need to go. Like, I'm at RIT in New York. I want to go to my friend's beach house in California. So the network layer would be like, okay, you're going to take a bus to the plane, or you're going to take a bus to the airport, a plane to California, and an Uber to your friend's beach house. Now, let's say on the way to the airport from New York, my bus shuts down. The network layer will call an Uber for me so I can make it the rest of the way to the airport. So that's the error control right there. The protocols that operate here are MTP3, IPv4, ICMP, NAT, and ARP. All right, I'm just going to take. Oh, that's nasty. I could hear that. It's like ASMR, but really loud. So unlike layer 2 attacks, which primarily come about inside the network, layer 3 attacks can be performed remotely over the internet. One of the common attacks is called IP address spoofing, which is where an attacker impersonates a target by changing a packet's IP address to look like it came from the target. Another common attack is where like compromised routers will drop packets that are supposed to be forwarded. This is called a packet drop attack or a black hole attack. As a result, these packet drop attacks are classified as a denial of service attack. IP address spoofing can be mitigated by deploying packet filtering to detect inconsistencies. Packet drop attacks, on the other hand, are much harder to detect and prevent because packets are routinely dropped because of lossy networks. In general, a good idea is to implement some sort of deep packet inspection, or DPI. DPIs use granular analysis of all packet headers rather than just like sourcing IP addresses and like listing them and all that. So it's easier to detect actual inconsistencies on a network. Next, we have the transport layer. Layer 4 is responsible for the process-to-process communication and the retransmission, segmentation, and reassembly of data. You can think about this like a ferry, but without an onboarding and exiting process. So it's like you'll have all the passengers on the ferry, and the boat is responsible for keeping them safe. However, the people, like I forget what he's called, but the guy who drives the boat, he doesn't need to know like what stop you need to get off at. Like, he's just responsible for keeping you on the boat and safe and all that. He doesn't give a crap where you're supposed to get off. So protocols that operate here are things that most of the freshmen are probably learning about in class, like TCP and UDP. Common attacks at the transport layer include Smurf attacks and SYN flood attacks. Smurf attacks are a type of distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS attack for short. Its name comes from the malware DDoS.smurf. Its name comes from like how Smurfs will work together to take down larger enemies. Smurf attacks essentially use malware to overload a network resource by broadcasting ICMP echo requests to devices across the network. Devices that receive the request respond with echo replies, which creates a botnet-like situation and just generates a high amount of ICMP traffic. Another common attack are SYN flood attacks, which essentially just send a ton of SYN messages to a server so that many fake connections are made and leaving a bunch of insecure ports open, which could then easily be attacked or crash the server. Ways to protect against these things are firewalls and intrusion prevention systems. In addition, it's smart to provide like inline and out-of-band deployment to ensure that there's not a single point of failure on the network, because if you have a single point of failure and it just breaks like that, you're gone. Oh, also there's port scanning, but I think we cover that later. So then there's the session layer, or layer 5, which deals with the establishment, management, and termination of like data. It specifies the mode of operation like full duplex and half duplex, and provides the means of setup or tear down and communication nodes. Essentially, the session layer enables communication between nodes and the ability to synchronize and manage the data passed between them. Protocols that operate at this level are the short message peer-to-peer and the author domain signing practices, or ADSP, which if you've never heard of that, it's because it was pronounced dead in 2009. But it's really the only other protocol that's there. Common attacks at this layer include man-in-the-middle attacks and session hijacking. Man-in-the-middle attacks occur when an attacker exploits a vulnerable router by using tools to intercept and read the target's data. Man-in-the-middle attacks are super broad and can happen in many different ways. Session hijacking, on the other hand, is where an attacker exploits a session key. And session keys and sessions are essentially just where like you log into a page. Like, that's probably the most common example when you're like logging into SIS. That's a session. And yeah, so the best way to prevent session hijacking is enabling protection from the client side. This includes things like installing and updating antivirus and anti-malware software. Preventing man-in-the-middle attacks, however, are a bit more difficult because they can happen in so many different ways. But some prevention measures include using HTTPS over HTTP, and using VPNs, updating routers, and changing default passwords on routers. The next layer is the presentation layer. Layer 6 is responsible for the data transmission, encoding, and compression of data. Its focus is representing and preserving the data by the application layer entities so that it can effectively transfer data to the layers above and below. This is things like, in terms of the protocols that are used, would be ASCII and EBCDIC, which is another protocol that's similar to ASCII, but it's just named different, I guess. I don't know anything about EBCDIC. Oh, okay, so is it not used anymore?
It is still used.
Oh. It's used in mainframes, if people didn't hear that. There we go. All right, so you can think of this layer like a florist's logistics coordinator. Flowers are super delicate, they're temperature sensitive, they break easily, and they have a short lifespan. If the delivery is not spot on, then the flowers will die. So the packaging is super important. The wrapping can't be too tight or the petals will fall off as soon as it's unwrapped. And the delivery method needs to make sure that nothing can fall or press against the flowers or else the flowers will be crushed. Essentially, you need to make sure that the flowers or packets will be presentable to the customers, aka the layers above and below the presentation layer. Layer 6 is all about how the data is supported, and a vulnerability that surrounds this is SSL hijacking. SSL is a protocol that is used for establishing authentication and encrypted links between networked computers. SSL hijacking is really not that common in terms of the other attacks that I've talked about. A really famous example of this is the Superfish program. Superfish was adware that Lenovo installed on computers by Lenovo, so it was 100% Lenovo's fault. A few years ago, the US government said to 100% uninstall Superfish because it used certificate authority to allow man-in-the-middle attacks to introduce ads on encrypted pages. So what would happen is Superfish would get the user's encrypted data and could access that information and give it to the adware. So it took really sensitive data on pages that it really shouldn't have access to and was oh, we're gonna advertise stuff to you relating to this now. And then ways to prevent this attack from happening is just don't install Superfish or uninstall it if you have it. So there you go. The last layer in the OSI model is the sole means of the application to access the OSI environment. There are two modes, connection mode and connectionless mode. Connection mode facilitates quality of service stuff, security, identification of parties, error control, and modes of dialogue. Connectionless stuff is really around the subset of things that I've already mentioned. It's just, it doesn't have as good as error control, and the security is mediocre. The application layer supports flexibility, such as naming and the length of host names, and maps domain names to appropriately handle DNS errors. I would say that the most important thing to remember about the application layer is that it deals with stuff it deals with things you use on a normal, everyday basis. Think of your mom playing solitaire on her iPhone. That's really what this layer is all about. And the protocols at this layer is, this isn't right. This looks like Bobby's slides. I mean, it's oh well, I can keep going, but. Yay, thank you. But yeah, no, we cool, thank you. Yeah, just HTTP, FTP, and Telnet. Security issues at the application layer consist of things we hear about in the news. Examples include things like viruses, backdoors, Trojans, keyloggers, all those things. And ways to prevent all this is installing and updating antivirus and anti-malware software, email filtering, especially for phishing stuff, and employee security training. So now that we have covered the OSI model and the vulnerabilities and mitigations at each layer, let's look at two examples of how businesses could apply this knowledge to their security. For the first example, let's look at one of those shady TV hosting companies, Naruto episode 1, and you go to some shady site, yeah, one of those. And quick disclaimer though, I don't endorse watching TV illegally. I don't watch TV. I probably see 2 movies a year. I just think that this example really illustrates the beauty of the OSI model. So first we need to consider the audience of the company. For a general TV hosting site, the audience is 30 and younger, so they're usually pretty tech savvy. In addition, a lot of these websites will offer dubbed, subbed stuff, which means that there's an international audience that needs to be accounted for. As a result, these websites become tend to become very popular very quickly and end up enemies of legitimate TV companies, and things like DDoSing and other web exploitation are a given because these companies can essentially go ham, and yeah, it just isn't great. But anyways, this layer most relates with physical security, which often shocks people, but yeah, it's like the root of most of these problems that a TV hosting company would face are things like content accessibility for an international audience, which all that does is relate to physical security. So things like if there's an earthquake, or if someone gets into a building or finds out where your servers are, if they can't attack you online because you're using a service like Cloudflare, so you can't be DDoSed, their best bet is to go burn down your building, which has actually been tried before if you Google it. So another thing is just having multiple backups at this layer. Like, if you have lots of backups for all your shady TV hosting content and all that, you can be like right up and running again within a minute. Like, it doesn't matter if they burn down one of your buildings. For our second example, let's look at a small jewelry store. Small jewelry stores hold a lot of expensive items, and they usually cater to a wealthy audience, which means that if you do something wrong on the security side of stuff, you can be sued very easily. So things like PCI DDS, because if there's a data breach or you mishandle credit card information, like that's not going to be good. Furthermore, using something like PCI DDS will ensure that you've actually fit into the regulations and all that legal compliance stuff, so when something inevitably does happen, you can't get the crap sued out of you because you didn't follow any of the government regulations. Furthermore, we want to consider the business itself. Small jewelry stores are usually have like 1 or 2 people running them. As a result, they probably don't have an IT person on staff, and probably will not make security a huge focus of their company. This means you need to consider what the company is willing to do. This would be installing antivirus and anti-malware software, maybe doing some type of online security training, but overall it's not going to be much. So when you think about it, which layer of the OSI model does this relate with? Does anyone actually want to answer? Has anyone been paying attention? Yes, that's perfect. Yes, the application layer, layer 7. Great job. Very proud. So here's the other thing. With all the slides I've covered so far, each of the mitigations I've mentioned will actually cover multiple areas in the OSI model. The only reason why I've really separated it out for each slide is because, in general, those specific solutions will be linked to that slide. However, when you have all these slides with organized, like different parts of, with organized, how would I explain this? With organized solutions at each layer, you can then combine and choose whichever ones you want, whichever ones fit your business's needs. This way, when you're a small jewelry store, you don't need to be using Cloudflare or using a ton of VPNs, because you just don't need that. You're not going to be DDoSed as a jewelry store. It's just probably not going to happen. So that's kind of the beauty of using the OSI model in business decisions, because it just gives you an outside perspective when you really don't have one. You don't have IT professionals on staff, so it's great to just look at a model that brings up all these weird concerns that you may not have thought about, and yeah.